Hi there, welcome to Floating in Books. Today I have it ready with me for you. Well, I'm doing my makeup while I'm chatting about why I feel you should not correct people's English online. This is going to be a bit ranty, so let me just get started. Welcome to everybody watching today. I thought it would be fun to sort of combine two things that I like to do, which is to go on a bit of a tantrum, but while I'm also doing my makeup. I have a makeup channel as my main channel, in case you didn't know, and I didn't really have an idea what to film for this channel this week, because I wanted to do a wrap-up, but every time I try to read a book, I fall asleep. So I haven't read much since I came back from Florence. So I still have like one or two more books that I would like to finish before I want to tell you how I feel about the books I've read recently. So I was like, I need something to fill the space. So that's why we're doing this video today. So let me get my hair out of my face and get started. I will leave all of the makeup bits that I'm using in the description box down below. This video isn't about the makeup, it's about what I would like to share with you. So I'm not a creator who does a video like this a lot, where I just chat about a topic while doing my makeup, because I always get distracted about by the makeup, and then I want to chat about that and I forget about the topic. So I hope I can stay on topic, and I'm also filming this as a true get ready with me because I'm about to head out to work in a little bit. So yeah, I hope you enjoy watching something like this. Let me know in a comment down below if you'd want to see me do this more often, because we definitely could. So yeah, today's topic is going to be why I feel you should not correct people online if you hear them make mistakes in English. And this is a very dense topic that needs a lot of unpacking. So in case you don't know, my day job isn't being an online content creator. I'm an English teacher. That's what I do. That's what I have done for close to 16 years now. It's been a while. And in order to get that degree and to become an English teacher, I did a degree in English, and one of the topics I specialized in was world English, English around the globe, English accents, and sort of the influence of society on English as a language and how we view that language. And a big part of that field, it's called sociolinguistics, has to do with correctness and when language is good. And this is why I wanted to do this video, because not only is it my background, but because I filmed my videos in English, I very often get comments from people like, with all best intentions, especially if they know I'm an English teacher, they feel they are even more justified in correcting my English. But the reason why I wanted to film this video isn't just my English, but also because I've seen this happening to other creators, not only on this platform, but also on other platforms, people who are native speakers. And then I'm like, I feel that there's a time and place for everything, and I don't mind it if people say like, hey, you're supposed to, pronounce it this way, but I don't think that people realize what they're doing, because I know they have the best of intentions. I know it comes from a good place, but from the research I've done and from what I've seen in my actual classroom, one of the biggest setbacks that learners have is, when learning a new language, is insecurity about how they sound, and this fear of making mistakes. And that fear of making mistakes is even rooted within the educational system and how we teach language, I feel. So I'm an English teacher who's of the opinion that the word what is good English and bad English has no place in my classroom. And I feel that there's a time and place for everything, and that correcting people's English is something you only do if A, they ask for it. Hey, I'm making this this video because I want to work on my English. Let me know in a comment down below. Or if that person, if you're in a language learning setting, like a class or whatever, and the purpose is to get feedback on your English. This is often not the case when people film a video online, and that's why I feel that commenting on people's English should only be done in those two cases and in no other case. And the reason for that is what I've seen in practice, but also what I know through research, where this idea of what correct English, but this goes for any language, not just English. I just know the most about English. That's why I stick to that topic. That this idea of correctness is actually not coming from a very helpful perspective. And by doing this, you are actually actively discriminating against people. Because correct language, linguistically, does not exist. Did you know that? So the idea of correct language and language being correct is actually quite new to us. As like if we look at the entire history of human beings having language, it's only been because of the introduction of general education, so education for the masses, that this even became a thing. And that happened like at the end of the 19th century. So in terms of like all of humanity and for how long we've had language, this idea of things having to be correct in order to be accepted is just not a very well-established idea. Now, what it is usually steeped in is setting people aside, saying, you are different. Your spelling isn't good. Your accent isn't acceptable. And very often we draw lines that are completely arbitrary and are incredibly political. Because where does the idea of language being correct comes from? Politics, classism, racism. It's all steeped in all of the isms you can think of, sexism even. I mean, there is research from the 60s that claims that men and women speak differently and therefore need other things. I mean, to an extent it's true, but what the researchers said was the reason was incredibly sexist. And by now, a lot of the research actually has proven the opposite. So a lot of the things we think we know, and this has also been embedded in language learning for people who very often try to learn to speak English, who don't have English as their native background, very often, even like, you know, the companies that, you know, say like, oh, you're this level of English, they're usually native speaker companies, for-profit companies that make money off of people's insecurities and the need for, you know, having a certain level of English in order to advance in your career, for instance. Whereas I'm of the opinion that as long as we are able to communicate and we can understand you, anything pretty much goes, because it should be about understandability. But what it's being used for, and I'm not saying that people leaving comments on my videos correcting my English have this intention, but what you should be very careful with, this is the point of the video, why I think you should be very careful with these things, is because historically and even today, it is used to discriminate against people. There are researchers who believe that once we establish equality in like a societal means for, you know, different genders and different races and everything like that, that the field that we will use to discriminate people is going to be how they speak. That, you know, just by speaking with a certain accent, you are not accepted. And this has definitely been the case. There is this like thing called standardization of language, which is again something that didn't happen until like the late 19th century. And it's just being used to, you know, draw a line between who's in and who's out. And by correcting people's English online, you are participating in doing this, especially if the aim of the video isn't for someone to practice their English and getting the feedback. I think that if you can understand that person perfectly, you have no right to tell someone, you should say it like this because native speakers say it like this. we have a world that is filled with non-native speakers. There are by now far more non-native speakers of English in the world than there are native speakers. And the standards we are held to are native speaker standards. Yeah, so your English isn't good enough unless you speak English to a point where I cannot tell that you're foreign. Which, if you think about that just for a minute, sit down, think about it. It's incredibly terrible, because here you have someone who's, in my case, dedicated their life to be able to speak the language at a level where most native speakers cannot tell me apart from who they are, but that I make one really tiny mistake that a native speaker wouldn't make, and then people immediately go like, oh, look at that. Ooh, why can you be a teacher of English? And then I'm like, why this need for perfection? It is because I go into my classroom claiming to not know everything and owning to my mistakes that my students feel safe in my classroom and I get them to learn something. Also, the fact that I am an English teacher who mainly teaches English to non-native speakers, that's been my career, means that I have a tendency to over-articulate and enunciate far more clearly than most native speakers would. It's why, if you've ever turned on the captions on my videos, YouTube has no issues picking up on what I say. The algorithm can very easily identify what I'm trying to say because I speak so clearly. And that's from all of the years of teaching to very often students who need a little bit more than a native speaker that's just rambling at them and they don't understand what is being said. Now, I'm not saying that I'm doing this perfectly. I'm trying to be very mindful of this. I sometimes also walk up to my students and ask them things in Dutch if that's the language that they speak, especially if they don't have that much of a high level. But class-facing situations, everything is always done in English. And I think that when it comes to you don't know what has gone into it, and for especially the native speakers to say hey, this is a mistake you're making. Yes, it's a mistake, but do you know where I come from? Did you know that until the age of 18, I wasn't able to even hold a conversation in English? This is all learned. Everything you hear me say has been taught, either self-taught or through lessons that I've taken in the past. So for especially native speakers to come up to me and leave these kind of comments on my videos, I'm like, have you ever tried to learn a language to the point where you can do an academic degree in it? Or degree, I should say, not agree, degree. Because if you haven't, then I don't feel you necessarily have the right to call me out, because you don't know how difficult it is to try and be consistent. And I very often film videos at the end of the day. I'm tired. This is my outlet. This is my creative outlet. I'm not here to try and be the best English speaker in the world. That's not my aim with my videos. By the way, if you want to know, the palette I'm using is the Bella Beauté Bar Smoky Glam. That's what we're going into right now. So then I'm like, if you've never tried, then I'm like, please don't. And the reason why I wanted to make this video is because I saw people commenting on Hank Green, who's a native speaker, a native speaker of American English. If you don't follow him and John Green, his brother, have had a YouTube channel for decades. They are as far as content creators go, they've seen everything. So I'm he did a TikTok recently about how the bubonic plague had influenced modern diseases. That was what the TikTok was about. And the first comment I saw in his comment section was people correcting him because it was supposed to be pronounced bubonic instead of bubonic. And then people were saying, oh, but bubonic is more British English and bubonic is American English. So even as far as English goes, when it comes to English pronunciation, it is incredibly inconsistent. For instance, whenever I talk about eyeshadow colors, one of my favorite colors is mauve, but that's the American pronunciation. British pronunciation would be mauve. And in American, I believe you can do both. But also because of those inconsistencies and because I watch both British and American English, and I've been exposed to both for years. In fact, fun fact about me, when I was at uni, I had to pick an accent to sort of aim for because I had pronunciation classes for sure. By now, universities in the Netherlands don't seem to offer that anymore because by now it's deemed no longer a goal for people who study English to have a native-like accent. But in my days, it was. And I was told, because I had never lived in a country where American English was the norm, that I had to do a British English accent because I had picked up my American accent initially from TV. And that was not a good enough reason. So I actually went through 3 years of British English accent training, which is why some of my English is infused with more of a British thing. But then I spent a college semester in America, and because I already had, or I should say the United States, of course, I went to Virginia to study abroad, and I came back with a very heavy American accent whenever I spoke English. And therefore, like, in my brain, things don't always go right because I've been taught two things. And then I just decided to stick with the one that comes most easily to me, which is the American English and not the British English. That's just a little bit, like, it doesn't feel like me. So that's why I've settled with this. But I know, and I'm very well aware, that that's because, you know, I say cocky instead of khaki. I'm not being consistent in my American English accent, but I also know that if I were to say khaki green in my English language learning classroom situation, none of my students would be able to understand me because they, like in Dutch, it's also khaki. So it's the British English pronunciation is closer to the Dutch one. So I know they would understand that more clearly. So I've made choices, very conscious sometimes, of how to say things, how not to say things based on my career, but also because that's sort of like the melting pot of the English experience I've had. And I think that that's the charm of my accent and my English for the most part, is the fact that, you know, my English reflects where I've been and what I've learned over time. And I think that's beautiful and I don't want to get rid of it. So when people then leave comments on my video saying things like, oh, but that's incorrect English. And I'm like, you think that I don't know that? That I don't hear my own mistakes? I'm the person editing all of my videos. Trust me, I know. I know exactly what I'm doing wrong. But this is also, like, whenever I come across a student who's very self-conscious about their accent and they feel they speak too Dutch, that's usually the reason why they refuse to speak any English in the classroom. It's because they think they speak too Dutch. Like, it's very audible that they're Dutch. And then I'm also like, you know, you just need to go for it. Because if you don't do it, if you don't make the mistakes, you're never going to learn. That's the thing with language learning, is that unless you train it and you keep at it, you're never ever going to improve. And this idea of, you know, people immediately jumping on the bandwagon and correcting people when they're not being asked to be corrected, or if it's not part of the situation that that speaker is in, creates this level of uncertainty that I see with a lot of my language learners, that I see in my classroom, where I'm like, it's such a shame. And by the time I see them, because I work in higher education, very often they've already been ruined by colleagues who've, like, you know, drilled it into them that this is what's correct and this is what you're supposed to do. And I'm like, oh. And then I only have like 3 lessons with them to try and make them see, like, just do it. Try to keep going. That's how you improve. Because they've all had this experience. I need to try and find a brush. Hold on. They've all had this experience by now that they've been abroad where they've been thrown into situations where they suddenly needed their English or their Spanish, if that's the language they chose. And all of a sudden they are like, they find out that they're capable of you know, making things work if they have to. And that's always been the beauty. Like, you send them out into the world, and that's when they realize, like, oh, I can do a lot more than I think I do. But I always feel that that's because we put the emphasis on the wrong things in the education we give our students. And I feel that it's an oversight within education. Of course, we are trying to do the best we can. I need to look ahead in this mirror for this lower lash line thing. Ooh, these are very sparkly. I like it. But you know what I mean? So that's sort of where I'm coming from. And that's why I just think that if you want to leave comments correcting people's English, that you just have to be very careful. I mean, like I said, I hear what I do wrong because I edit my own videos. However, I don't realize all of the mistakes as I'm making them, because to correct yourself while you're trying to voice your thoughts is incredibly difficult. It's one of the most difficult things to do. And very often I'm able to backtrack and sort of figure out my thoughts as I'm talking. And especially now, I'm multitasking. I'm talking to you in English about a very complex topic, and I'm doing my makeup at the same time. I know that when I go to edit this, I go like, oh, Micah, why did you say that like that? Or why did you use that word there? And, oh, that should have been an adverb and not an adjective. That's my biggest mistake, actually. My most common mistakes is the fact that I sometimes use an adjective where it should have been an adverb, because in Dutch we don't make that distinction. So to get that into my brain has taken me 20 years, and I'm still not perfect at it. But this is why I never expect perfection from my students, and my mantra, my message to them is always just try your best. If I can understand what you're saying, even if you have to try 3 times, you're speaking English, and that's what's most important. And this is why I'm sort of always very surprised when people feel the need to correct complete strangers on the internet. Like, it's not just my videos. I see it happening on so many creators, especially if they're non-native speakers, where especially native speakers just say things like, oh, I can't listen to your voice because your accent is too strong, or like, I've seen so many of those things being done. And then I'm just like, and it's not just native speakers, it's also more educated non-native speakers who do this as well. But did you know that in order to get to a level of English that is deemed native speaker worthy, you need to have, in the CEFR system that we use here in Europe, it's C2, and that equals a PhD level of education? And that what is recommended for most people who work in sort of like international professions is B2, that is 2 levels down. And it's not required to be perfect. It's actually, it literally says, if you look at those criteria, it says that you're allowed to make mistakes, and that as long as the message is being communicated, that's fine. And what I've always found super surprising is that, you know, people will nitpick at very, very small mistakes that if my students would make them, I would applaud them for it. And what people completely disregard is the fact that I have a level of vocabulary that outshines most native speakers. like if I had to take a vocab test, and you know, I've taught classes that prepare students for B2, C1, and C2 level CEFR exams. And I usually like fill them out to try and see what, you know, students might run into. And without paying attention, if I just go through it in like 15 minutes and I answer all of the questions I can answer, I pass a C2 exam without any thought, without reading the things carefully. So I know that if I were to take a official exam, in fact, I had to, when I went on that trip abroad, as an exchange student, I had to take a TOEFL test, and I very much outperformed the bandwidth that I had to be in order to, like, they had this, like, if you scored below the bandwidth, you had to take extra lessons or you would be denied entry. Then there was a bandwidth where you had to take the extra lessons. That's how it worked. And then there was a bandwidth where it was like, you are, you know, you can enter. And I scored above the this is where you can enter. Like 100, like not just like 1 or 2 points, but like 100 points higher. So I know there is nothing wrong with my level of English. Yes, do certain non-native weird things pop up from time to time, and am I aware of that fact? Yes. You don't have to tell me. You really, really don't. And when I see people leaving these kind of comments on native speaker videos, like the one with Hank Green, I'm like, what do you want from us? I think that especially if, you know, like me, I've always worked in international settings with people from very many different cultural backgrounds, you'll see that every different cultural background brings something to the table when they start to speak English. And I find a beauty in that. I appreciate that. And I appreciate people trying to communicate in a language that's not their own. And I find that that is far more important than trying to nitpick and say like, oh, but that's not how a native speaker would say it. And I'm like, I don't care how a native speaker would say it. There are far more non-native speakers across the world by now, and by holding us to a very arbitrary standard that is steeped in colonialism, nationalism, racism, sexism, all of the isms you can possibly think of, I think we are not being very kind to one another. And if there's one thing I think we need at the moment in the world, is a little bit more kindness. So that's my advice to everyone who's been watching this video. Be kind, spread love, be nice to each other, appreciate not the differences between us, but also the things that we have in common, and people making an effort to try and make it in the world, because that's what I see in my students every single day, is that they're trying and they are trying their best, and I'm trying to get them to be their best, and being part of that is the best part of being a teacher, in my opinion. So just be nice to each other. So this was a bit of a rambly, ranty video. I do hope you got something out of it. Thank you very much for joining me here today. I will be back next week with a new video. I think the wrap-up has to wait until sometime December because I won't be able to finish any books anytime soon. I will be back very, very soon with a new video. I'm gonna have to see what I'm gonna do next week, but it could be another fashion-related video. Would that be something we're interested in? And I will have a list down below with all of the products I used, but they were all from my Shop My Stash. And I need to head out to work, so I hope to see you in my next one. See you next week. Bye-bye.